ideas of common good change over time. So I always have used an example of a charity in the UK, in England, called the Weeks Charity. This is a charity in the 15th century in the UK. And it was treated as a charity. It was paid no taxes. And what was its charitable purpose? It was to gather what are called faggots, which are these bundles of wood that are used to burn witches at the stake. So in 15th century England, it was considered to be a common good to burn witches. And so this sort of pointed out the impossibility of operationalizing the concept of common good. So we ended up coming up with what we call the functional structural definition of the nonprofit sector. And these are features that in certain ways act as surrogates for common good, but they are operational notions. So we said first of all that we're looking at organizations. We're not simply looking at casual gatherings of people for a coffee some morning. There had to be some structure in a sociological sense. It did not have to be legal because the laws of countries are very different. But there had to be an institutional reality to it, which meant some permanent, some structure, decision-making, sociological definition of what an organization is. Secondly, it had to be private in the sense of not part of the apparatus of government. The previous definition in the economic system based the definition on the source of revenue. We rejected that because it created a strange thing where an organization funded by government automatically was considered part of government. And these organizations, even when they receive government support, have a degree of autonomy to them. And so the key is not part of the governmental apparatus, and we spelled out in this manual, in this handbook, what we meant by not part of the governmental apparatus. It had to do with who's on the board and what the structure of governance is. Third definition feature, a very important one, is that they do not distribute their profits to some set of owners or members. They can earn profits. They can earn more in a year than they spend, but they are not allowed to distribute the profits. They are non-profit distributing. Fourth feature is that they are self-governing institutions. They have within themselves the capacity to govern themselves. They are not controlled by some external entity. And we said that the best way to tell that is, can the organization put itself out of business? Can it cease to exist on its own authority? And so in my university, we have a board of trustees. If that board of trustees wants us to cease to exist, they can vote to stop the Johns Hopkins University. We have laws that say what happened to the assets, but this is fully in the power of our trustees. If your trustees said that, I suspect that they could not make this institution stop. They would have to get an act of the legislature. And this is the difference between a public university and our system and a private university. So a very important notion. And then finally, these organizations had to be non-compulsory. There had to be an element of choice in people's involvement in them, either working for them or in some other way serving on their boards. This differentiates a non-profit or civil society organization from, say, a caste that somebody is born into, or a family that you're born into. You don't choose to be a member of a family. This is something that is required. And in a way, if people are involved in an organization that doesn't distribute any profit to them, and that is not compulsory, and they still involve themselves in it, then implicitly they must believe that there's some public good in it. And so we have built public good in, but we've built it in a sense by the votes of people choosing to support such organizations. And so we have found a way to operationalize the concept of public good. This is a very broad definition. It embraces just wildly disparate entities, everything from trade associations to some universities, not all, they have to fit the definition. Social services, environmental groups, clinics, hospitals, human rights organizations, daycare centers, even sports clubs, and even professional organizations, so long as they meet these 5 definitional criteria. That they are organizations that are private, not part of the government, that are non-profit distributing, that are self-governing, and that are non-compulsory. So we think that there is a reality here that has enough commonality that it is possible to talk about it. That's not to say that there aren't differences, and we develop a whole classification system to highlight the differences, but the argument is that, that this is a sector with enough commonality to it. The second myth is that, okay, this thing exists, but it's a pretty marginal actor economically. And this is a very deeply embedded notion that the civil society sector may be important, but it's not important as an economic actor. So we began to collect data on the scale of the sector. How many people work for it? How does that represent, how does that stack up compared to other industries in countries? What is its economic impact? And what we concluded was that this is an enormous economic force. We have data on some 40 countries now, and we have estimated that the operating expenditures are about $2 trillion. That they employ 48.5 million full-time equivalent workers. This represents 5.5%. That figure is an old one, I'm sorry, I didn't change this one figure. It should be 5.6, the economically active population. I don't know if any of you here are in economics, but any industry that represents 5% of the workforce of a country is an enormous industry. That's 1/20 of the entire labor force of a country, and there are very few industries that are at that scale. We discovered that if you, just to put this into context, that if the third sector were itself a country, it would be the 5th largest country in the world in terms of GDP. So here is the GDP of the 4 largest countries above it. This is the 1.9 trillion US dollars of the nonprofit sector. And so globally, this is a major actor. It is a significant economic force. You can put that into further context by comparing the employment of the nonprofit institutions to the employment of major industries in the same countries where we did our research. And so this is for 40 countries. Here's that 48.5 million workers in the nonprofit sector, both paid and volunteer. And we adjusted the volunteers, of course, to convert them into full-time equivalent workers. Here's the employment of the utilities industry in that country. All the workers in the utilities industry in these 40 countries, there's 6 million workers. So it's 1/8 as big as nonprofits. Here's transportation, here's construction, and here's all the manufacturing. And so the nonprofit workforce is bigger than the entire transportation industry in these countries, almost as big as construction, and about half as big as manufacturing. So again, very, very significant force. Another way to see this is to compare the employment in the nonprofit sector to the largest private employer in each of the countries that we did our work in. So we added up all the nonprofit employees, compared them to the total employment of the largest private firm in these countries. Just another way to get perspective. So these are the 48.5 million nonprofit workers. Total largest private companies total in these 40 countries, 37 countries at this point. About 4 million workers. So nonprofits are 10 times larger than the largest private employer. Another way to see this is in the GDP. When we began to do the implementation of our UN handbook, we moved from looking at employment to looking at contribution to GDP at different variables. We now have data showing the average GDP contribution of the nonprofit sector in these different countries, and we compared it to the GDP contribution of other industries in these countries, and the same basic conclusion emerges. This is the utilities industry, this is construction, this is all of financial, banks, insurance companies, and so the nonprofit sector is on a par with construction, close to being on a par to the financial sector. I think the financial sector has shrunk, as you may have noticed. This is all of transport, storage, and communication. So you can get a sense of where the nonprofit stands compared to other industries. It is an enormous economic force. And this became a very important way to capture the importance of this sector across the world. This shows the value added in just Canada, one country that implemented our handbook compared to other industries in that country. And again, you get the same story, that it exceeds retail trade, it exceeds mining, oil and gas extraction. And interestingly, just the volunteer piece, this is the contribution of volunteers, exceeds the total value added of the agriculture sector in Canada. And one final measure of this, it's one thing to compare the value added of nonprofits to the entire economy, 5%. When you look in particular industries where nonprofits are active, the figures are much even more dramatic. So this happens to be data on Belgium, and it shows the share of the total value added in these different fields that nonprofits accounted for. So they're 66%, 2/3 of the value added in the entire economy in social services, 52% in recreation and sports, and 42% in health. So you begin to get a sense of how important this sector is. So that's myth number 2. Yeah. Okay, we'll speed it up. Okay. So myth number 3 is the distribution of this sector among the different parts of the world. And the American belief, very strongly, is that civil society organizations are really uniquely an American phenomenon. This has been a very strong belief in the United States that we have the, certainly we have the largest, and we may have the only nonprofit sector in the world. Because after all, Europe has a welfare state. They don't have nonprofits. This is the belief, this is the myth. We are alone in the world and have a robust nonprofit sector. And in many minds, our mission is to teach the world about how to create these institutions. And certainly it's been the case that there's no civil society sector in Scandinavia, because that clearly is a welfare state, where we would not expect any nonprofits to be operating. Well, again, armed with the data for the first time, we were able to test these ideas, and it turns out that they are just profoundly wrong. So this shows the share of the workforce of different countries that nonprofits represent. And very curiously, the ones at the very top, I mean, you notice the US is not at the top. The ones at the top are all Western European countries, or countries that are very similar to Western Europe, like Canada and Israel. The Netherlands, 16% of the workforce when you include volunteers. Belgium, 13%. Canada, 12%, so forth. You don't get down to the US until pretty far down the line. And what's going on here? How can this be? Well, it turns out that our concept of the European welfare state was profoundly flawed because of the lack of these lenses that bring into view the nonprofit sector. What Western Europe really has is a welfare partnership between nonprofits and government. The delivery system of the welfare state in Europe, in most of the countries, certainly in the northern part, not in Scandinavia, but in Belgium and the Netherlands, in Germany, the delivery system are nonprofit institutions. Many of them are religiously based, but not exclusively. And this whole reality was missed by people doing research on the European welfare state. And even in the Scandinavian countries, you'll notice that Sweden beats the US. My God, how can that be? And it doesn't because of the volunteer component. And so when we focused only on paid workers, yes, the Scandinavian countries are pretty far behind. But they have very robust volunteer organizations that are active in political advocacy. This is how they got the welfare state. They were very active politically and protesting for workers' rights, and they insisted on protections through the state. But then they also have enormous recreation, sports, cultural, and to some extent social welfare organizations. And so this reality just completely completely turns on its head a lot of the mythology of the sector and its structure. We also have data that goes into other countries, and you'll notice that Brazil is ahead of some of the other Latin American countries, but is behind the curve in terms of development of this sector, which is a cause, I think, of some concern. These data are old. We have not fully updated the Brazilian data. We expect that it has grown somewhat, but this is a task that we're still facing. So those are the third and the fourth myth. Let's see if I can pick up the pace. Myth number 5, we may not get through all of this, so let's see how far we get. What's that? Well, it's up to myth number 5 has to do with the role of volunteers, and there is another very powerful myth in this field that that volunteers play a more important role in the civil society workforce in developing than in developed countries. The idea is that paid workers have begun to replace volunteers in the more developed countries, whereas in the developing countries, the third sector relies more on volunteers. And again, this is a very strongly held belief, and we now have some data that allows us to look at it. So, first of all, the scale of volunteering. Let me just fill you in on the scale. I already hinted at this. We had discovered through our data that of the total workforce, full-time equivalent workforce, about 56% is paid labor across the world in our countries we focused on. But 44% is made up of volunteers. So volunteers are a very crucial part of the total picture of the world's workforce. This shows you the full-time equivalent volunteers versus employment in selected industries. And you can see that even when you compare the volunteer workforce to the full-time employment in some industries, it's a pretty big number, 20.8 million workers who are volunteers in the nonprofit sector. So it's a pretty significant workforce. This shows you the contribution to GDP of volunteers versus certain other industries in Canada. This is similar to the chart I showed before. And you can see that the GDP contribution just to the volunteers is larger than the agriculture sector's GDP contribution. Very striking figure for Canadians to see the power and the importance of volunteers. We've also calculated the share that volunteering, the contributions of time, represent of all philanthropy in the world in these 40 countries. Think of volunteering as a contribution of people's time. You can put a value on that contribution of time through knowing the occupations of the volunteers, and you can compare that to the cash contributions that form the core, presumably, of philanthropy globally. And it turns out that charitable giving is only about 32%, about 1/3 of all contributions. The bigger part is from volunteering. It represents 2/3 of the contributions if you put a value on those contributions. And we have now taken the next step, which is to estimate what would volunteer land look like if it were its own country. We estimated the total amount of volunteering, total number of people volunteering in the world, and the total value of that volunteering, what would it look like? And it turns out that volunteer land, if we put all the people who are volunteers in one country, would be the second largest country in the world, behind only China, with about 971 million volunteers compared to the 1 trillion. These are adult population, I should say, in China. So it is an enormous force. And in terms of the economic impact, if it were its own country, it would have a GDP that would be the 7th largest in the world, behind only France and just ahead of Canada. And this is just the volunteers. This is not the rest of the nonprofit sector. But to get to the answer to the question, there are some, it turns out that there is no difference between the share of the workforce that is volunteers between developing countries. It's virtually identical. And one of the reasons for that is just this incredible volunteer component of the workforce of the nonprofit sector in the Nordic countries, in Scandinavia, Finland, and Sweden, and Denmark. These are the countries in which we have data. There is significant difference, and as you go down into the welfare states, the paid staff component is increased and the volunteer component is decreased. So this is an important part of the sector. It's been overlooked completely, and it begins to reshape our conception of the nonprofit sector. The sixth point has to do with the relationship between paid staff and the reliance on volunteers. And the common mythology is that paid staff